Have you ever imagined being chosen by God to explore the heavens and uncover the secrets of the universe crafted by His hands? How many mysteries lie hidden within the vast expanse of the cosmos that we mortals have yet to comprehend? Would you dare to witness them with your own eyes? There is one figure in the Bible who was granted such grace, a man considered the most righteous and upright of all time, Enoch. From the fallen angels to the cursed souls, from fiery volcanoes to bottomless abysses, every vision left an indelible mark on him. But what secrets were concealed in the light of the angels and the shadows of betrayal? The Watchers, once beings of light, now stand as symbols of destruction. The stars, created to shine brightly, were bound in eternal darkness to defy divine command. Enoch not only witnessed these events, but recorded a world where light and darkness intertwined, a universe where every action, whether great or small, carried consequences. Do you have the courage to step into this journey and explore this fragile balance? Join me as we turn the pages of Scripture in the book of Enoch, retracing the path Enoch walked. Each of his experiences holds invaluable lessons for us, offering warnings about the consequences of sin and the limits set by the divine order of the cosmos. Welcome to Why the Book of Enoch Was Banned, Part 3. Subscribe to the channel and turn on notifications so you don't miss the thrilling Part 4 coming soon. In the shadowed realms of ancient texts, where each word whispers from another world, the Book of Enoch unveils a captivating and eerie mystery. Enoch, the chosen one, hears a voice from on high, a voice of such authority that, though unseen, he knows it to be the Most High. The voice resounds, not merely through Enoch's ears but pierces deep into his very soul. Enoch, righteous man and recorder of justice, come near and hear my voice. This is no ordinary call, it is a decree, a sentence for those who once bore the light of heaven but fell into the temptations of fleshly desire. These beings are the Watchers, angelic guardians, once immortal spirits soaring freely through the heavenly expanse. Yet, their longing dragged them down to the earthly realm, where they indulged in the embrace of mortal women, the daughters of men. They, once pure, defiled themselves in lust. The voice of the Most High grows stern as he declares, "You were meant to intercede for mankind, not for mankind to intercede for you." An unfathomable inversion of divine order had occurred when the Watchers, symbols of righteousness and holiness, descended into acts no different from mortal frailty. They not only lay with women, but took them as wives, producing offspring unlike any creature seen before. The children of the Watchers and the daughters of men were neither human nor divine. They were the Nephilim, giants whose every step could shake the earth. According to ancient texts, the Nephilim embodied chaos, destroying everything they touched. Some accounts claim they stood 300 cubits tall, approximately 450 feet by modern measurement, a figure that chills the imagination. Yet their monstrous physicality was matched by their symbolic role as harbingers of corruption, resulting from holiness tainted by carnal ambition. The Most High continues, his judgment falling like a hammer on the guilty Watchers. You once lived an immortal spiritual existence, but now you have defiled yourselves with blood and flesh. You have indulged in desires meant only for those who perish and fade away. These words are not merely punishment but a denunciation, exposing the weakness of the Watchers, spirits who allowed their souls to be shackled by earthly flesh. Echoes of this tale resonate in the myths of other civilizations. In Greek mythology, the Titans, giant deities cast down and imprisoned in Tartarus, reflect the story of the Watchers. In Ethiopia, where the original Book of Enoch was preserved, legends speak of a divine flood sent to cleanse the corruption spread by the Nephilim and their progenitors. But the most haunting question remains: why? Why would beings of such holiness, created immortal, exchange their heavenly station for eternal condemnation? Was immortality too heavy a burden? Or was the allure of human flesh too great? This mystery has no clear answer, leaving only a void in the minds of those who seek it, a space haunted by the image of fallen angels and their giant offspring. The Most High not only pronounces judgment, but offers an explanation. I created woman so that mankind could multiply and lack nothing on the earth, he states. But the Watchers, immortal spirits, did not need such propagation. They transgressed their nature, a rebellion against the cosmic order established by the Most High. Amid the solemn judgments of the Most High, Enoch not only listens but also witnesses a terrifying reality where heaven and earth intertwine in a tragedy beyond redemption. After rebuking the Watchers for their fall, the Most High reveals the devastating consequences of their sin. He declares, "You have no need for wives, for your dwelling is in heaven, not on earth." The presence of the Watchers on earth was not just a mistake, but an intrusion, shattering the boundaries between the divine and the mortal. The Watchers were not created to love, let alone to marry and reproduce. They were pure spirits, immortal beings without the need to engage in earthly realities. Yet, driven by an inexplicable desire, they abandoned heaven, a realm eternal and unchanging, to walk upon the ever-shifting earth. They sought human women not to guide or protect them, but to indulge in carnal desires. They were never meant to possess. The repercussions of their actions were not confined to their downfall, but spread across generations, leaving an unhealing scar on the earth. The offspring they bore, the Nephilim, stand as stark evidence of their departure from the natural order. These giants, far exceeding human strength, lacked the balance inherent in natural beings. According to ancient texts, the Nephilim were not only colossal, with estimated heights reaching hundreds of cubits, an immense measurement by modern standards, but also possessed extraordinary power and an uncontrollable destructive instinct. Their presence shook the earth, with every step becoming a source of terror for humankind. Yet, the tragedy does not end with the physical might of the Nephilim. Upon their death, they did not vanish entirely from the world. The Most High proclaimed that their souls would not be permitted to return to heaven. These souls, born of spirit and flesh, shall become evil spirits, and the earth shall be their dwelling. His words etched an eternal curse into their existence. No longer physical beings, they transformed into wandering spirits, invisible yet ever-present, waiting to sow chaos. These malevolent spirits carried an insatiable hunger, one that could never be satisfied. They needed no food or drink, yet their cravings were more intense than human hunger. They will torment, oppress, destroy, and wage war, warned the Most High. Their hunger was a hunger for darkness, blood, pain, and destruction. They became unseen but potent entities, haunting humanity from dreams to reality. Wars, disasters, and atrocities seemed to echo their presence, the restless spirits forever seeking to fulfill their destructive desires. The Most High clarified the role of these spirits within the cosmos. The spirits of heaven shall return to heaven, but the spirits born of earth shall remain on earth, he affirmed, underscoring an unbreakable divine order. The Watchers and their offspring had transgressed sacred boundaries, and the consequence of this violation was eternal existence in darkness. These spirits lingered and influenced humanity, spreading hatred and chaos and undoing what mankind sought to build. The danger posed by these spirits extended beyond chaos. They harbored deep resentment toward those who gave them life, humanity, They will rise against the children of men and women, for they were born from them, warned the Most High. This hatred, rooted in their unstable origins, became a natural response for spirits trapped in an in-between state, belonging neither to heaven nor earth. The haunting of these spirits is not confined to the Book of Enoch. Across cultures, from Greece to Egypt, tales of wandering souls and restless entities mirror the Nephilim's cursed spirits. In Greek mythology, the Sirens, Furies, embody the vengeance of unredeemed souls. In Japan, the Onryo are vengeful spirits, wandering between worlds, echoing the Nephilim spirits in their torment of the living. Yet, within the Book of Enoch, these spirits are more than symbols of anger. They mark a greater tragedy, the failure of both divine and mortal beings to uphold sacred order. The Watchers, once bearers of heavenly light, lost everything by succumbing to temptation. Their offspring, the Nephilim, represent imbalance, while the spirits left behind serve as chilling reminders of the consequences of breaking forbidden boundaries. The story offers no resolution. The Watchers remain imprisoned in darkness, the Nephilim destroyed, but the spirits endure, wandering between life and death. Their presence lingers in every horror humanity faces, from natural disasters to endless wars. They echo an era when heaven and earth intersected in sin and chaos. The lesson is not merely one of judgment, but a warning to humanity. Sacred boundaries exist not to restrict, but to protect. When humanity or divine beings violate these limits, the repercussions ripple across all dimensions of existence. In the deep shadows of ancient writings, the whispers of the Watchers and their malevolent spirits remain a somber reminder of the value of balance and order in a universe filled with unanswered mysteries. More than 2 millennia later, these words still resonate within humanity, like a warning bell tolling from the unseen realm. Somewhere, in the darkness of history, perhaps the Watchers still wait, with sorrowful eyes, gazing toward the light they have lost forever. Amid the resounding judgments from heaven, the Most High continues to unveil the unavoidable consequences of the Watchers' fall. The chilling revelations of chapter 16 in the Book of Enoch serve as a final indictment. After Enoch conveys the eternal curse that the Watchers would never find peace, the judgment extends beyond the sinners themselves to their legacy, malevolent spirits born from the flesh of the Nephilim. From the bloody days when the Nephilim were destroyed, a new darkness began to spread across the earth. From their flesh, evil spirits have emerged, and they shall destroy without judgment, declared the Most High, sounding a death knell not only for the Watchers, but all humanity. These spirits, embodying chaos and violence, continued to wreak havoc on earth as though destruction was their sole eternal purpose. These malevolent spirits are unlike any beings that have ever existed. They neither eat nor rest, but are eternally ravenous. They thirst for suffering and death, proclaimed the Most High, emphasizing their insatiable nature. Though invisible, their presence is felt in every disaster, every war, and every sorrow endured by humanity. They exist solely to destroy, yet they are exempt from judgment, a terrifying reality for mankind, which unwittingly enabled their existence. However, this destruction is not endless. The highest decrees, they shall continue until the consummation, the great day of judgment when all things shall be brought to an end. On that day, not only the Watchers, but also these malevolent spirits will face judgment. It will be the day when the age of sin and chaos comes to a close, and all is consumed under the divine light of justice. Until that day, humanity must endure a world where these spirits roam, spreading chaos beyond anyone's control. The judgment against the malevolent spirits does not end with their destruction. The Most High also turns his attention back to the Watchers. who had sent Enoch to plead for mercy. Yet that mercy would never come. You were once in heaven, but all mysteries were not revealed to you, declared the Most High, underscoring the folly and blind ambition of the Watchers. Despite their divine nature, they failed to grasp that they were bound by limits set by the Most High. Rather than accept these boundaries, they sought to surpass them, chasing after mysteries not meant for them, and were ultimately undone by what they could not comprehend. Worse still, the Watchers did not keep these mysteries to themselves. You have revealed worthless mysteries to the women, and through these mysteries, men and women have wrought great evil on the earth. The Most High rebuked, condemning not only the Watchers, but also exposing humanity's corruption, knowledge of magic, weapons of war, and the manipulation of nature became tools for humanity to amplify its destruction. The consequences extended beyond immediate actions. The mysteries revealed by the Watchers laid the foundation for chaos to persist through generations. They not only accelerated humanity's downfall, but also severed mankind's connection to the divine order established by the Most High. Every war, every violent act, every sorrow reflects the continuing influence of these dangerous mysteries introduced by the Watchers. In the fading light of chapter 16, a final message is delivered through Enoch. Tell them this: you shall have no peace, declared the Most High, extinguishing any hope for the Watchers. Once beings of heavenly light, they are eternally imprisoned in the darkness of judgment and torment. There is no refuge, no forgiveness, only endless suffering as a stark reminder to all who dare defy divine order. Across ancient cultures, the imagery of fallen divine beings and their catastrophic consequences serves as a warning. In Greek mythology, the story of Prometheus bears a striking resemblance as he gave fire, symbolizing forbidden knowledge, to humanity, resulting in eternal punishment. In other civilizations, legends of forbidden knowledge and cursed spirits echo the same fear, that crossing boundaries set by the divine leads to unimaginable consequences. As chapter 16 closes, it leaves a heavy sense of foreboding. The narrative is not just a historical record, but a cautionary tale for future generations. The Watchers, the malevolent spirits, and humanity bear responsibility for the chaos unleashed. Though the great day of judgment is yet to come, the haunting presence of these spirits continues to plague humanity, a shadow that cannot be dispelled. This is not merely a story of angelic fall or human corruption. It is a reminder that when sacred boundaries are broken, the repercussions are not confined to a single era but ripple across all generations. Until the day when all is consumed under the light of justice, the darkness of sin will persist, an inseparable part of the chaos ignited by the Watchers. Now, we embark on a journey through the heavens with Enoch in the following chapters. In the misty shrouds of a world beyond comprehension, Enoch is guided by strange entities. These beings are like flames, burning fiercely yet moving with the grace of breathing shadows. When they choose, they appear in human form, recognizable yet exuding a sense of detachment from the mortal realm. They are not just guides but living symbols of the interplay between light and darkness, life and the unknowable. The journey begins as they lead Enoch to a place of absolute darkness, a space where no light can penetrate. Within that void looms a massive mountain, its peak piercing the heavens like a spear reaching toward the divine. This mountain is not mere stone. It represents the bridge between the realm of the divine and the earthly, a mysterious gateway to forbidden secrets. There, Enoch feels not only his insignificance, but also the immense weight of the knowledge awaiting him. As he ventures deeper, the entities guide Enoch to a scene of profound mystery, the places of the stars. Here, he beholds the treasures of the heavens, eternal lights that never fade. gleaming like radiant jewels in the endless darkness. Yet, these treasures are more than light. They hold immense power and danger. The storehouses of thunder, containing flaming bows, blazing arrows, and fiery swords, are not merely objects but manifestations of judgment. Each bolt of lightning, each flare of fire, serves as a reminder that this power is not just a weapon but a force of destruction capable of consuming an entire world if unleashed. The further Enoch travels, the more alien the reality around him becomes. A place where natural laws are overturned. He is taken to living waters, rivers that never run dry, flowing from the deepest recesses of the earth. These waters are unlike any on the mortal plane. They emit a faint glow as if carrying the soul of the world within them. Yet, alongside this life-giving force is the fire of the West, where, at each sunset, the light is drawn in to sustain an eternal cycle. This is no consuming fire but a primal power, maintaining the delicate balance between day and night, light and darkness. The highlight of this journey is the River of Fire, where flames flow like water, ceaseless and powerful. This river is not merely a sight to behold, but a living emblem of transformation, creation, and destruction. As it pours into the great sea of the West, Enoch feels the raw force of primordial power, as though everything begins and ends here in an unending cycle. But the journey does not stop there. Enoch is led to a place where darkness engulfs everything. Here, no light, life, or creature dares to tread. This realm is like an infinite abyss, where all life is consumed and all souls are lost. Enoch senses something greater, formless entities observing him from the shadows. This isolation is not empty but terrifyingly full, where every corner holds secrets beyond human understanding. As the faint light fades, Enoch reaches the mountains of winter, where cold is not merely a temperature but a living force that penetrates the marrow. These peaks, combining darkness and frost, create a desolate, haunting landscape. They are the source of all deep waters, as if they are the heart of the oceans, where every drop carries the tale of life and death. Each stream flowing from here is not just water, but the current of time, of forgotten memories. Finally, Enoch is brought to the place where all rivers meet, the mouth of the abyss. Here, the land ends, and darkness prevails. He witnesses the convergence of all rivers as though they are pouring into an infinite black void. The mouth of the abyss is not merely a physical space, but a symbol of transition, where all things are created and destroyed. The journey in chapter 17 of the book of Enoch is not merely an adventure through mysterious realms, but a confrontation with the universe's secrets. Each step brings Enoch closer to forbidden knowledge, making him acutely aware of his smallness within an infinite cosmos filled with incomprehensible wonders. What Enoch witnesses is not merely scenery, but profound reminders that between light and darkness, life and death, lies a fragile balance. And within that balance, the mysteries of the universe are never fully revealed, but appear only as faint glimmers in the living flames, leaving behind unanswered questions, a part of the vastness into which Enoch has ventured. In the dense mist and the howling winds echoing from realms beyond human comprehension, Enoch continues his journey past the boundaries of understanding, recounting the mysteries he witnessed in chapter 17 of the book of Enoch. From the roaring river of fire and blazing pillars of light to the bottomless abyss swallowing all illumination, every step fills him with awe while unveiling the universe's secrets. Now, as darkness recedes, Enoch is guided toward new revelations where the mysteries of heaven and earth blend into a strange, indescribable harmony. As faint light unveils a new scene, Enoch gazes upon a land of primordial treasures, a place where the currents of wind, pillars, and invisible foundations of the earth are stored. I saw the treasuries of all the winds. Enoch recalls as if these winds were not fleeting breezes but forces upholding the entire cosmos. Invisible yet purposeful, each wind plays a role, like gears driving the immense machine of the universe. From this vantage point, Enoch sees the cornerstone of the earth, the origin of all creation, where the entire cosmos was established. This cornerstone is not merely a symbol of beginnings, but a nexus where primordial elements converge, forming a firm foundation for the earth and the heavens above. Like unseen, powerful arms, the four great winds extend from this point, supporting the earth and upholding the celestial vault, a vast dome Enoch describes as the roof of the universe. The winds are not idle. I saw them stretch out the firmament of heaven, sustaining the pillars of the heavens. Enoch recounts with awe and wonder. These pillars, forged from the primordial forces of the universe, stand between heaven and earth, safeguarding the world from collapse. From here, the winds of heaven operate in inexplicable ways, guiding the sun, stars, and light back to their resting places each day. Yet the winds do not confine their strength to the heavens. They sweep across the earth, lifting clouds as if painting the sky with invisible hands. The paths of angels also become visible, mystical routes connecting the heavens, accessible only to those belonging to the divine realm. At this threshold, where heaven seems to merge with earth, Enoch perceives the existence of a second heaven, where the secrets of nature and divinity blend in perfect harmony. As the winds lead him further, Enoch encounters a land where the light never fades, a region ablaze day and night. There, he sees 7 magnificent mountains, each a marvel of creation. The 3 eastern mountains are composed of the rarest and most dazzling gemstones, one of vibrant, multicolored stones, one of pure white pearls, and one of deep crimson rubies. These mountains emit an enchanting radiance as if they belong to another world. In contrast, the 3 southern mountains glow fiercely with vivid red, as though forged from blood and fire. Yet the most extraordinary is the central mountain, a wonder beyond imagination. This mountain rises straight into the heavens, its summit disappearing into the brilliant light of the celestial realms. Made of pristine white marble, it is not merely a mass of stone, but a symbol of divine power. Its peak, adorned with sapphire, glows like a crown atop the head of a deity. Enoch realizes that this central mountain is not just a symbol but the throne of the Most High. From this place, his light and power radiate, sustaining the workings of the entire universe. Every angle and contour of the mountain seems to tell the story of creation and the inviolable authority of the divine. The journey through chapter 18 is more than an exploration of mystical realms. It is a confrontation with the primordial structures and eternal forces of the cosmos. From the winds that uphold the sky and the steadfast pillars to the resplendent mountains reaching the heavens, everything Enoch witnesses is not merely a spectacle but a profound symbol of divine balance. In the brilliant light of the sapphire stones and the eternal flames of this wondrous land, Enoch not only becomes acutely aware of humanity's insignificance, but also feels the weight of secrets yet to be revealed. As the light from the mountains begins to fade, he understands that all he has seen is not just part of the universe, but also a warning to humanity of powers and entities far beyond human comprehension. This story is not merely a journey of discovery, but a reminder that in this world, nothing is accidental. Every element, whether a fleeting breeze or a towering mountain, has its role in the grand design of creation. The Book of Enoch does not merely document what he saw, but also raises unanswerable questions, leaving a mysterious shadow in readers' minds where the light of truth has only begun to shine. As the light fades from the majestic mountains, Enoch continues his journey, guided by beings beyond human comprehension. Before him, a blazing fire emerges, not an earthly flame, but a storm of living fire, burning brightly like an eternal torch. This fire marks a new threshold in Enoch's journey, leading him to the most terrifying secrets of the universe. Crossing this fiery gate, Enoch steps into the final reaches of the world, where the earth ceases and heaven closes. Here, the sky is complete. He realizes as if standing at the ultimate boundary of creation. Yet, this end is not perfection or peace, but an unsettling reality. As he ventures further, Enoch discovers a bottomless abyss where heavenly pillars of fire rise from the darkness. These fiery columns ascend into the sky and plunge into the earth with neither end nor measure. These flames are not natural phenomena, but supernatural pillars, reminders of the Most High's power. Unlike the heavenly pillars Enoch had seen, these seem cursed, burning in ceaseless chaos. As their light illuminates the surrounding land, Enoch glimpses a region beyond the abyss, a place where the natural order is utterly overturned. Crossing the abyss, Enoch reaches a place with no sky above and no solid ground below. This is neither land nor sea, but a suspended, desolate space, barren and haunting, devoid of any signs of life. There is no water, no birds, no semblance of hope. It is an abandoned land, a metaphysical desert where darkness and silence devour everything. This desolation is terrifying not for its emptiness, but for what it represents, a profound separation that neither heaven nor earth can reach. Amid this endless darkness, Enoch sees 7 great stars burning like massive volcanoes. They do not stand still but move in strange, erratic orbits as though compelled by an unseen force. Drawn to the sight, Enoch asks his guide about their nature. The answer he receives unveils one of the most horrifying truths of his journey. This is the boundary of heaven and earth. The angel explains, "These stars and the hosts of heaven have become prisoners." Enoch is stunned to learn that these are no ordinary stars but beings that once radiated the light and beauty of heaven. Now they are imprisoned, burning in endless torment, like cursed torches. These are the stars that transgressed the command of the Lord from the beginning. The angel continues, revealing that these stars failed to appear at their appointed times when summoned. Their disobedience incurred the wrath of the Most High. He was angry with them and bound them to suffer until their sins are fulfilled. The angel's words echo in Enoch's mind. These stars are not just symbols of failure, but a warning of the dire consequences of defying divine boundaries. Bound in this place, they will endure for 10,000 years, a span of time beyond imagination, before the final judgment is executed. As Enoch watches the stars turn within the flames, he feels their agony. This is not merely punishment but a lesson for the entire universe, that no being, no matter how powerful or radiant, can escape the ultimate authority of the Most High. These stars, once the pride of heaven, are now exiled entities, consumed by the fire of their pride and rebellion. Chapter 18 of the Book of Enoch is not merely a journey of discovery, but a tale of punishment and caution. Enoch witnesses not only the grandeur of mountains and fiery pillars, but also the darkest corners of the universe, where light and darkness collide in chaos. And stars, once the glory of heaven, are now chained flames. In the flickering light of these fiery columns, Enoch cannot help but wonder, is there redemption for these beings? Or are they doomed to burn in solitude and suffering for eternity? The answer, like many other secrets Enoch uncovers, lies beyond human reach. But one thing is certain, what he has seen here is not just part of a story, but a chilling reminder that every act of defiance carries its price. As Enoch departs this forsaken land, The light from the captive stars lingers on his back, a warning that will never fade. The Book of Enoch, with all its revelations, is not merely a record of secrets, but a chronicle of judgment, unavoidable consequences, and unanswered questions, leaving an indelible shadow in the minds of those who read it, where the light of truth only begins to flicker. In the dim light between heaven and earth, where life and death intertwine, Enoch continues his mysterious journey. Amid the somber shadows and the radiant flames of eternal fires, Uriel, one of the guiding angels, halts beside Enoch and points to a vast yet fearsome land. Here, Uriel says, is where the angels who bound themselves to women shall stand. These words echo in Enoch's mind like an eternal verdict, not only for the fallen angels, but also for humanity, who were led astray by these supernatural beings. Uriel explains that these angels, once the brilliant lights of heaven, betrayed their sacred duty by abandoning the heavenly realms and mating with the daughters of men. From this unnatural union came not only the Nephilim, ferocious giants, but also a stain of evil that could never be cleansed. The fallen angels, wielding their supernatural powers, transformed their souls into various alluring yet malevolent forms. Continuing to deceive humanity, they defiled mankind, leading them astray to sacrifice to demons as if they were gods. Uriel declares, Uriel's words are not just a revelation but a historical judgment, unveiling a cycle of sin repeated across generations. According to ancient texts, these fallen angels introduced dangerous knowledge, magic, divination, and even false forms of worship. Through their manipulation, humanity descended into ignorance, worshiping malevolent entities as if they were true gods. This defilement not only tainted the world, but also plunged humanity into an inescapable spiral of destruction. The judgment, however, does not end there. Uriel, with a voice both solemn and authoritative, reveals the fate of the women who were drawn into this fall. The women of the angels who went astray shall also become sirens, he says. Sirens, familiar symbols in Greek mythology, are hybrid creatures, half human, half bird, with voices that lure sailors to their doom. But in the Book of Enoch, the sirens are darker and more sinister. They are not merely seductive beings, but embodiments of punishment and corruption, eternally cursed to wield their allure in the shadows. These sirens, in this account, were not created from anything, but were once living women who loved, only to be transformed into malevolent beings through their union with the fallen angels. Standing before this scene, Enoch is not merely an observer, but a unique witness. I, Enoch, alone have seen this vision, where all things lead to an end, and none shall see as I have seen, he recounts. This statement affirms Enoch's unparalleled role and warns about what he has witnessed, the most terrifying aspects of existence, where heaven, earth, and the abyss intertwine. The account in chapter 19 is not merely a tale of a fall, but a reflection of the frailty of angels and humans. The fallen angels, once bearers of divine light, allowed their desires and ambitions to drag them into darkness. The human women, though deceived, could not escape their cursed fate, and humanity, small and fragile, was swept into the spiral of sin by worshiping entities that should have been destroyed. As Uriel speaks of the day of great judgment, where all beings, fallen angels, sirens, and the wandering souls of humanity will be judged, Enoch senses the closing of a long and grueling cycle of sin. They shall remain here. Uriel points to a vast, shadowy expanse, until their sins are complete, and they are utterly destroyed. The story of the angels and sirens is not only a reminder of the power of divine judgment, but also a testament that every action, no matter how great or small, bears consequences. In the final words of the chapter, the Book of Enoch reveals a chilling truth. Both divine and mortal beings, when led astray, cannot escape the grasp of justice. The punishments witnessed by Enoch are not merely annihilation, but an existence of perpetual suffering, where these beings are imprisoned in darkness, forever deprived of peace. Chapter 19, with all its eerie and mysterious elements, leaves a cold yet contemplative impression. It is not just a story of what has occurred, but a warning to humanity that sometimes the most enticing things are what lead us into the deepest darkness. In the dim light of Uriel's revelations, Enoch sees not only the end of the angels and sirens, but also the conclusion of an entire cycle of sin that the world has borne. The story in the Book of Enoch reveals a profound and somber lesson. Every action, no matter how small or great, carries consequences. The fall of the angels serves as a reminder that even the most powerful beings are not immune to ambition and desire. In a world where light and darkness intertwine, pride and disobedience not only lead to destruction, but also spread ruin far beyond the offenders themselves. For humanity, it is a warning about the power of choice. Wrong decisions, no matter how justified they may seem, can shatter the divine order, unleashing pain and chaos that cannot be undone. The justice in the Book of Enoch is unyielding and ever-present, underscoring the truth that no one, neither divine nor mortal, can escape judgment. Ultimately, the book delivers a cold but necessary truth. In the shadows, responsibility and consequences are the burdens of lost souls. Power is not salvation. Only adherence to order and humility can preserve the fragile balance of the universe. Please subscribe to our channel to enjoy more captivating Bible stories from us.